Welcome to Live Players, where political scientists and strategists Samo, Burja, and I discuss the key individuals with the power to alter our current society. Every week, we provide analysis of the news and case studies of live players as well as key institutions and technologies that make up the global power landscape. Let's dive in.
Samo, let's talk about the EU. What are some of the challenges they face, or what is sort of the landscape right now?
The EU started in its own way as a relatively ambitious project to achieve two goals, one of which was notionally peace in Europe, a goal that many argue that it became superfluous for after the development of NATO and the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? So it traces its origins to the steel and coal community, basically centered on France and the Benelux countries, with West Germany and Italy joining at the very start of the Cold War. It originally also had sort of a defense component. There was an organization called, I think it was the Western European Union, and it was a military alliance. So once NATO came into existence, that dimension became a dimension of sort of strategic optionality, essentially, and in a way, a backup option for France if it did not, after all, want to fight a particular war with the Soviet Union. It's the same reason France sort of pursued a nuclear arsenal to begin with. But the other aspect is less well known. People talk about the common market and prosperity and so on. There is an excellent book, however, called The American Challenge, which was a book analyzing U.S. economic advantage, and it was already published in 1968. So already in 1968, medium-sized European countries, developed countries such as France and West Germany and Italy, West Germany, note, was still, in the midst of the German economic miracle, noted that while they had achieved good growth after the war, European firms were at a long-term structural disadvantage versus the US. And one of the most important points raised in this book, which I warmly recommend, it has not dated, if anything seems prophetic 50 or 60 years on, is the sheer scale of the unified market that the United States has. The US, even in the 70s, was a nation of 200 million. Today, it is 330 million. It has a very high average GDP per capita, which means that as an environment to do business in, as soon as your business makes sense, it can scale to such a great extent, even without any of the complex politics of globalization and free trade agreements, that, once those happen, if there were a level playing field between, say, the medium-sized European markets and the large US market, I think generally you would expect US firms to beat out European firms. So the European Union as an economic community was supposed to overcome the problems of scale. And if you think about these two aspects, one is like making peace between countries that used to be in deep hostility and competition with each other, countries that have waged many wars, and the other side, how to have national economies be prosperous, even in small countries and small or medium-sized countries, when truly, the economies of scale are almost the dominant factor in industrial society. These are both fundamentally issues of scale. It's the question of how can we keep a Europe of many small political entities while having the benefit of these larger political entities. Back in 1968, this would have been the United States and the Soviet Union. Today, it is the United States and China. And maybe in the future, it'll be India as well. The EU has been an imperfect answer to these questions. And the imperfections do not show immediate signs of being overcome. Now we can go into the imperfections. For starters, there is no digital common market in the EU, if we start with the economic. Every country has different privacy laws, different requirements. The linguistic fragmentation is, of course, a problem, but it is a surmountable problem. After all, when American companies, software companies begin scaling in the US and they, come to these other markets later, it's not that much work to launch a Spanish version or a French version or a German version. It doesn't matter if it's a search engine or if it's literally even almost a nonprofit type thing like Wikipedia was. I feel in the age of Google Translate and even better options, localization just means hiring a few language experts maybe, and then it's actually just fairly trivial to implement. The trick is navigating a new regulatory and legal environment. There's no commonality for how Uber is handled across the EU. There's no commonality for the gig economy. There's no commonality even for advertising, right? And the stuff that is common is this very onerous legislation that's layered on top of these peculiarities of the national digital environments. So it's not that the sort of onerous Brussels legislation, really unified it. It was just an extra layer of barriers to entry. So the digital space is not truly a unified market. The labor space is arguably not quite a unified market. The Schengen zone still does not include all EU member states. So even labor is not fully flowing freely between new member states and the rest of the EU. And in particular, some countries have taken exceptions also to taking in migration of labor. Finally, there are attempts to manage the flow of goods and to have it be a properly scaled market, and that's been more successful. So when people, before Brexit complained about Brussels setting the curvature of bananas and like the minimum size of tomatoes and the ripeness and all of that, that's partially the price of standardization, right? It is similar to the complaint where DC regulates so many things through the interstate commerce clause, because it turns out that interstate commerce, understood properly, be it between states that are part of the US federal system or between nominally sovereign states unified into the EU, it touches almost everything. It entails almost everything. There is no regulating an economy and there is no economic unification without a deep aspect of administrative and political unification. And that in a way was always also part of this idea from the very beginning, imagined by, some of Europe's so-called founding fathers. How do we set Europe on a course? I'm referring here to statesmen such as Jean Monnet, who's a Frenchman who developed the original plan for the coal and steel community, or Robert Schuman, Konrad Adenauer. Some people even count Winston Churchill, who had a late career turn towards a European community as an alternative to being fully absorbed into the United States and as a possible third bloc. So we can go through the list of those statesmen. They were trying to set up bureaucratic ratchets that would make it inevitable that Europe would become a superstate. The bureaucratic ratchets work. It's bounded ever closer together. The key question is, though, their imagined sort of conspiracy of very competent, basically cosmopolitan European statesmen, people who still remembered the 1900s and the sort of like aristocratic system that existed and that exploded in World War I and was then even further marred by the rise of like extreme nationalism and honestly like the rising of new propaganda-oriented elites rather than old landed nobility elites, and sort of like catered to like mass political appeal, either left or right. That didn't happen, right? Instead, we had this like very narrow visioned, bureaucratic, technocratic, blind execution of a blueprint from the 1950s. So in a way, the EU might be the largest geopolitical bloc in the world that is truly dead player. They are carrying out the work of building the foundations of a superstate, but are not even aware that the goal is a superstate. It was supposed to be this relatively elitist, quiet project where step after step the pillars were built, and in a moment of political crises, live players from across different European countries, if I use my term for this, right? Let's call them also, we could call them statesmen. They would have thought of them as European statesmen who understood how vital it was that European countries don't go to war with each other, and how vital it is that they're not economically outcompeted by the United States, or propaganda-wise and ideologically absorbed into, and geopolitically absorbed into, say, the Soviet Union. They were supposed to step in and activate these last few remaining pieces of this incomplete structure. The message of it is reflected, honestly, even in things like the architecture, right? So if you look at the European Parliament in Brussels, right, what is that building evoking? When you look at the building is clearly evoking the Tower of Babbel, the classical depiction. It has this like round tower-like structure, and it feels unfinished. It looks like it's been not completed. And this was meant aspirationally. Unfortunately, right now, I think this tower will remain unfinished. I think it'll end up seeming almost prophetic in a way. I don't think the European Parliament is the real seat of sovereignty, but neither do I think that the European Commission is being very agentic. And there's very little evidence of live players on the European Commission. Merely, again, people who are following their immediate political and bureaucratic incentives. I touched earlier on some of the failures. One failure, integrated immigration policy, because in order to have free movement between the member states, you have to basically usurp the authority over the country's borders. And then you either set basically a low-key free immigration policy, or an undocumented free immigration policy, or a restriction of immigration, which is what, in opinion poll after opinion poll, is what European citizens actually like. Whatever of these you set, you have to set for the whole EU, because there can be no Schengen. And the second one was the digital unified market. And then sort of the final one is a European defense. Unless you have a European military or joint European procurement for the separate European militaries that supersedes and is independent of NATO, you cannot have a European defense industrial complex. NATO might work for European defense in aligning Europe to the United States. It certainly, I think, works for the United States if it wishes to be in competition or conflict with Russia. Then of course the US needs NATO. And, if Europe wants to be safe from Russia, if that were a genuine concern, NATO works too. However, because of the way the rules work, whenever any of these countries try to meet NATO requirements, they inevitably face competition from the US defense industry. So if the most cost-effective or most advanced weapon, at least, is always a European weapon, and if the arms industries of Europe that do exist are fragmented, if you make your truck tires in Estonia and make your hazmat suits in Germany, and you make your jet fighters in France and Britain's not even in the EU anymore, and you make some small arms in Belgium, there are no economies of scale here. And there's no R&D. There's no scientific R&D. One of the surprising facts of how the US economy works is that it has, of course, this very free market story of itself, but historically, the DoD, the military industrial complex, basically bore the cost of R&D effort and basically carried out industrial policy, where vast amounts of government spending were poured into technologies that were later commercialized, or poured into infrastructure that then also the private market could use, or set requirements and contracts that would then, go back to the civilian sector in surprising ways. Boeing wouldn't be Boeing without its military contracts. but also without the Boeing of the middle 20th century, the US jet age wouldn't have happened and mass commercial air travel wouldn't have been as developed. And certainly without the defense spending, there wouldn't be as many trained pilots and as many airports as the US had in the 50s and 60s either. Nor would the economies of scale for constructing new planes, often based on these military designs or tooling, would have been as effective. So truly, America does industrial policy, or did industrial policy 50 years ago, and did R&D. There wasn't private sector. It's just hidden under national security, right? So America has free markets and national security. Europe can have regulated markets, let's say. It doesn't even emphasize free markets that much. It could, but it doesn't really have EU-wide defense policy either. And if there's no unified defense policy, it's very hard to overwhelm the local political interests of like national champions. Can you imagine Estonia or Spain or Austria taking an economic haircut so as to make a German corporation or a French corporation more competitive in the global market? Right? It's a tricky political proposition. It's a political fight every single time. If your country is generally properly devolved in this political sense where there's delegation and autonomy, you can maybe sidestep it and say that, oh, we need union security or continental security. You can't even use the term national security without running into the paradox that the EU is not a nation and can't justify itself as a nation. So you can't even develop vast pan-European defense corporations that could make use of defense spending. So at the end of the day, it doesn't even make economic sense for European countries to meet their NATO requirement spending, because part of that spending is just tribute to the United States. Of course, it's paying to defend yourself, et cetera, et cetera. All the US arguments make sense, but often you're just buying US military equipment anyway. So, that it doesn't have the same economic benefit that defense spending has in the United States. So basically, without a joint military, there's no joint foreign policy. It's pretend to say otherwise. You have a fragmented foreign policy that's always in conflict with itself. It always relies on US leadership. It cannot be independent. Without a European military, you cannot have a European military industrial complex. Without a unified military industrial complex, it is difficult to fund R&D, and it is difficult to have economies of scale and development of weapon systems that you could export around the world to offset your defense costs, or technologies that are commercialized first in the European market rather than being commercialized first in the US market. The EU is partially aware of this. On some level, whenever you hear about a weird boondoggle-like European big science project, be it the pretty successful, very large telescope in South America that's EU funded, or be it the Galileo satellite network that is supposed to be the European answer to GPS. GPS, of course, being originally a military technology, only later commercialized, or be it ITER, the International Thermonuclear Reactor, right, experiment, where it's supposed to be the world's fusion, magnetic containment fusion experiment. Of course, other countries bought into it, but it really began as a European atomic project. Or even CERN, right, the great particle collider on the border between France and Switzerland, or the European Space Agency. All of these are efforts to fund things for Europe to keep scientists and engineers employed and further developing their talent that in the US context are just funded by the military. In the US context, you don't need big fusion experiments or particle accelerators. You already have a jobs program for US physicists. It's called the Department of Energy. And truly, the Department of Energy is the Department of Nuclear Weapons, right? And that's not in Europe, right? And in the US, the US Air Force develops aerospace and rocketry at least as much as NASA does. And NASA was already a sort of peaceful rebranding of the fact that we were racing with the Soviets to develop ICBMs. So in Europe, at least, they do a great amount of scientific spending. It does keep talent in Europe. It assists on the margin European companies and actually has good externalities, because unlike scientific research that's done by the US defense sector, very little of any of it is classified. In the US, sometimes scientific results are classified. You remember the controversy over various bits of mathematics that were basically classified for cryptography reasons, right? Like there was this whole big debate, can you classify a number? Can you classify a prime number? Like very, very big primes are important for cryptography. And also less crazy things, like are certain physics results classified that are relevant to the design of nuclear weapons in the United States? Yes, they are. This is mainstream acknowledged in history and all of that. So that would be sort of my opening point about this unfinished Tower of Babel, where there is no live player and no constituency to actually bring it to completion. So in a way, it works less well than the medium-sized countries. Yet if any medium-sized country leaves this quagmire, its economy immediately takes a hit, which we can demonstrate with the example of Brexit. Now, it's possible that economic hit is worth it. It might be worth it for a France or an Italy or even a Britain that had live players at the helm. They could overcome it. They could specialize, right? They could use some of the same techniques that, say, South Korea used. South Korea is basically a great example of a European-sized country. It's an Asian country, but it's only, a few dozens of millions of people. It's very comparable in size to an Italy or a Poland or a France. So these kind of economic strategies could be pursued, but they would require a rebuilding. And then on the other hand, a European superstate, even today, even in Europe's decayed economic and demographic state, would actually be potentially a rival to the US and a check on Russia in its own right and economic competition for China. I think in that case, Europe would be richer, right? Why would it be richer? Because it could pursue the same kind of trade policies that China pursues or the same kind of trade policies that the US pursues. And it could favor, it could have its own Huawei. After all, it has its own ASML already, right? And it could have a closed market for EVs, like the US is sort of, talking about 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. Why can't Europe put 100% tariffs on Chinese vehicles? And while you're at it, maybe Tesla too, right? So those kind of aggressive trade policies that favor an export-oriented but integrated economy could be pursued. And they're not going to be in this environment. So really, it's an unfinished construction. And I struggle to see where in the normal course of events, you reach either political or military integration that allows for live player action, rather than this automated ratchet set into motion, where every single year it makes more sense than the year before to think of the EU as a single state, but it never actually clicks and becomes a superstate.
Hey everybody, Erik here with a word from our sponsors. Fast forward to the end of 2024. Think about your goals. What can you do right now to give yourself the best chance of succeeding? If learning a new language is on your list, you absolutely need to check out Babbel. Babbel offers a range of learning tools, self-study app lessons, live classes, and even podcasts, which have always been my favorite way to learn. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel isn't just a game to kill time and make you feel like you're learning a language. It's not overly academic or rigid either. It's all about learning language for the real world. Babbel stands out because it's designed by real people using a modern conversational teaching approach. It's not always easy, nothing worth doing ever is, but it's straightforward and designed to help you start speaking in just 3 weeks. With Babbel, I was able to brush up on my intermediate Spanish to ramp up for travel to Argentina last year, and was able to set clear goals based on how much time each week I wanted to practice. Join millions of Babbel language learners across all age groups. Here's a special limited time offer for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only at babbel.com/Torenberg. That's babbel.com/Torenberg, spelled BABBEL.com/Torenberg. Rules and restrictions may apply. The tech world turns to the Brave browser for its unbeatable privacy protections. But did you know that Brave also has a private ad platform? Brave Ads offers first-party targeting, and it's been cookieless since day one, so you can relax while third-party tracking cookies disappear from the web. Today, millions of people turn to ad blockers to avoid being tracked and pestered online. But Brave's new ad model aligns incentives for users and advertisers. Users earn rewards for viewing ads, which they can save, spend, or pass along to their favorite creators. And advertisers score points for respecting user privacy, generating ROI without invasive tracking. So whether it's high-impact announcements on the new tab page or keyword-targeted ads in Brave Search offers diverse, private, future-proof ad formats for all your business goals. Join the future of advertising at brave.com/ads. Mention Turpentine to get 25% off your first campaign.
Well, one question I have on the Brexit side is, well, and maybe use some background too on the significance of the decision, the impact or how we think about it, a bunch of years later, or in terms of the result, what it's led to and relative to what people expected it to lead to. And people were really catastrophic about it at the time.
Well, some people were very catastrophic and some were very optimistic. I felt there was definitely a number of contrarians. And, I'll honestly count myself among them. I was like, this is such a surprising thing. The people pursuing it were very smart. Well, maybe if they can make Brexit happen, they can fix all these other problems with the British government.
Right. And we're both wrong, basically. It was neither catastrophic nor the panacea.
Yeah, I think it was a modest negative. Not a big negative, a modest negative, right? So I think the British economy is a little smaller than it was. It has way more immigration than it did in the EU. I think that's not what the voters wanted. Let's be real. The voters should not be gaslit. At the time, it was very obvious that the voters wanted closed borders. It wasn't actually about national sovereignty. Maybe it was national sovereignty for the people leading the referendum, but the voters wanted to reduce immigration and they got higher immigration. And then, if the economists are right, that's been a positive for Britain's economy. And if the sort of like national culture, nationalist people are right, then it just entrenches British political dysfunction and makes the government less responsive to the needs of its citizens because the government can always import the voters it wants. So depending on who's right, that might be a plus or a minus. It's just the case that it's not what they hoped for. And in terms of British economic integration with the former British Empire, so with Canada, Australia, New Zealand, very modest, no real progress there. And honestly, no real progress in a closer alignment with the United States either. Britain is still militarily aligned with the US, but there's nothing approaching either a common market with the US or more economic cooperation with the US. So in a way, Britain is almost orphaned now. There's nowhere where it can scale. The three options for Britain were basically scale within a US economic sphere, scale within your own global sphere, basically integrate with Canada, Australia, and New Zealand for the sake of being another Anglo country that wants to remain somewhat distinct from America, but cooperate closely with it, or the sort of Winston Churchill post-war plan of economically dominate mainland Europe while letting the French kind of lead foreign policy. Like that's, by the way, the French kind of took that deal with Germany for a while, but that cooperation broke down in the 2010s. It sort of was happening, if you remember, in the Iraq War era, where both Germany and France coordinated to not go into Iraq. So whenever you hear all this humor about the French surrendering, etc., like that actually started during the Iraq invasion. Like there was a big propaganda push. Remember freedom fries? It doesn't actually go back to 1945. It doesn't go back to 1960, okay? 1945, the official politically correct story is that the French fought bravely in the French resistance, and they just had some bad decisions and some traitors and collaborators in government, and we got rid of them. And now the West is united versus the Soviet Union, right? Like that was the official line. it only became that, the French are, was it surrender monkeys or whatever. That sort of strain of jingoism that you hear mostly from the Republican side, and it's become kind of a cliche. I think it's literally just a propaganda campaign from the Iraq War era that sort of stuck with us. Anyway, Germany and France are clearly somewhat at odds in the Merkel era. At the start of the Merkel era, it was fairly harmonious, but now they're very desynchronized, and the economic and political, the geopolitical engine of Europe and the economic engine are broken apart. And, there was I feel British reluctance happened partially for good economic reasons, because if Britain fully integrated into what the more integrated EU was becoming, it would be German companies rather than British companies that would reap the benefits. Post-German unification, which Margaret Thatcher opposed, as did some French statesmen, the economic weight of Europe irrevocably centered on Germany. Germany just became too large, and Germany was too well positioned to take advantage of both the cheap labor, but also newly opened markets of Eastern Europe. And Britain had very few opportunities to compete with the Germans because regulations favor incumbents. So for Britain to outcompete within the EU, Germany would mean to lobby Brussels against the interest of large German and partially French companies to loosen regulations in a way that advantages British companies versus German companies, and maybe even drive German companies out of business, all the while complying with a foreign policy that would make the United States, its premier political ally, very angry, basically, or put them at odds, right? Certainly, if you imagine Britain had taken the French and German line during the Iraq War or on Afghanistan, I think the relations would clearly be much worse today, right? We'd probably come up with some jokes at the expense of the British, right? There would be some sort of bad feeling about it, even though, of course, like most Americans today, acknowledge Iraq was not done well, at least, and maybe it was an absolute disaster. That's not partisan now anymore, but back then it was a different world. I think what people forget is that often our cultural perceptions of global politics is sort of the wreckage and refuse of propaganda wars fought sometimes long before our life, like long forgotten propaganda wars shape our perceptions of the world.
Okay, we've given some overview, we've given some color. Talk about in the next few years, like if you're a betting man and you you do like think about this, where things like what's going to happen to the EU, or what are the different scenarios that could play out?
Well, I think the idea that was in the air in let's say the right in the United States, and sort of this kind of like international, let's call it international nationalism or international populism. There's this view that, there's going to be Le Pen in France and Meloni in Italy, and maybe even Germany is going to have a populist thing, and America is going to have Donald Trump, and then the West will come together and sort of like reform the problems that it has. And in the European context, reform the EU to be a more narrow free market, but a politically more decentralized entity where European cooperation would replace European decision-making. So what do I mean by this? If we look at a relatively successful example of European cooperation, like Airbus, it's a sort of British-French-Spanish partnership, but it's not a Brussels partnership. It has nothing to do with Brussels. These governments looked at their company portfolios and they're like, hey, these companies fit together, and together Airbus can be as big or better or competitive as Boeing, and actually will make good plane designs, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, a European travel market, it's like only half the size of the American commercial travel market, but still it's a good playground, right? So the cooperation of European governments on an ad hoc basis, economically, militarily, in that sort of vision replaced central EU decision-making that would have required dismantling Brussels it cannot be one country at a time leaves the EU, because it's shown that the structure of the EU did not shake nor fall apart, even when a country as large and as important in the European context as the United Kingdom left it. Why would it then shake or tremor if Poland left it, right? It wouldn't. It would actually strengthen the remaining union, whether or not it's a good idea, because one of the countries that might slow down consensus-based decision-making, which is actually a big problem for the EU, try doing anything when you need a unanimity of 27 voting organizations, right? Or 26 or 30 or whatever, right? That's one of the reasons, by the way, the EU is not expanding, because many of the small states, for example, in the Balkans, or even in Eastern Europe, the remaining fragments like Moldova or possibly Ukraine, possibly Georgia, they would just worsen this problem. Like all these small countries would basically want to vote for their own benefit. Europe has a similar problem to the problem NASA has, where NASA has to do something in all 50 states, whether or not it makes sense. Every single EU decision that goes through has to give something to all member states. And that's a problem, right? That means that there's no cost benefit analysis. There's just a political viability analysis. So the populist reform program for the EU, which is partially the nationalist one and partially a libertarian one and partially a civilization one, and depending who you talk to, it's bound to fail in the sense that the dismantling of the EU won't happen. So, okay, that political option's gone. Will the green option go, where the sort of climate change view has broad support in a number of European countries, including Germany? Some of that, of course, by the way, has geopolitical origin too. The Green Party in Germany is anti-nuclear, because the Green Party in Germany in the 70s, 80s, 90s, all of this thinking was anti-nuclear because it was also anti-nuclear weapons. Because Germany, West and East Germany, would have been saturated with nuclear attacks already if World War III had happened between the Soviet Union and the United States. So pushing for denuclearizing Germany was just another way of trying to push out NATO nuclear weapons out of Germany on the hope that this results in fewer nuclear strikes by the Soviet Union and maybe one distant day, a neutral Germany, right? So that's why Russia always was friendly with the Green movement to some extent, because at the end of the day, they would have preferred a politically neutral Germany to a pro-Western Germany as well. That's true in 1980. It's true in 1995. It was true in 2005, 2015 even. And the strange acquiescence of Greens to importing Russian gas was partially a consequence of that. I'm certain funding and intelligence and propaganda support from Russia did go to the green movements of Europe and probably persists to this day in some highly attenuated form. The energy policy is so complementary. The sudden fluctuations that the intermittent energy produced by solar and wind produce requires consumption of natural gas to provide power for the shortages, right? You need peaker plants essentially, and you need seasonal burning of energy. So it's either coal, which can be found domestically, but it's very dirty, or it's natural gas. So that was, energy-wise, also a complement to Russian policy. I think the Green program, now that Russia is in conflict permanently sort of with the Western world, and Europe is sort of permanently tied to the United States, in practice at least, will fail, because it is a program to increase energy costs in Europe at a time when labor costs are going up. So much like East Asia, in Europe, labor costs will inevitably go up. Unlike East Asia, energy costs are also going up, right? So say in China, they're building basically everything they can. They're building wind, solar, but they're also building lots of nuclear, and they're still building more coal. Their attitude is more energy through any means necessary. The government is not very smart in their energy policy, honestly. Their literal goal is by 2030 or so to match the energy mix the United States has. So there's no vision there to transform energy. They're just, let's do the US energy mix as fast as possible and as cheaply as possible. And then accidentally along the way, they innovate somewhat into production of, let's say, nuclear reactors. Japan, very happy to buy natural gas, even if it's obviously coming from Russia. So they'll even buy liquefied Russian natural gas just fine. South Korea also trying to build cheap nuclear reactors and so on. Nothing like this has happened in Europe because of green opposition. So even though nuclear power would be a wonderful solution for the cloudy parts of Europe, such as Germany and Scandinavia, it is precisely those countries which are least inclined to pursue nuclear power. The only exception are countries that are under immediate geopolitical pressure from Russia that value energy independence intensely. So countries like Finland and Poland and some other Eastern European countries are interested in building new nuclear reactors. And on the other side, France is interested in building more nuclear reactors because they have a nuclear industry, since it's anchored and necessary to their nuclear weapons, right, which they're not giving up. So if you have a nuclear industry to build nuclear weapons, you might as well build nuclear reactors, and you don't want to be energy dependent on anyone, especially since France doesn't even have coal. So for France, the energy independence thing since 1945, it's been very obvious. We'll try to integrate coal and steel with the Germans, but we don't actually want to always be dependent on German coal. And we certainly, we neither want to fight another war with Germans over the coal and steel, nor do we ever want to be energy dependent on Germany or the Middle East or anyone else. So that's why they pursued in the middle of the 20th century nuclear power. And, they can saturate further and they can lobby to export to Eastern Europe. Though currently they're competing with South Korea and with the United States. So even though Eastern Europe is now less inclined to buy cheap Russian reactors, they might buy cheap South Korean reactors, or they might buy expensive American reactors that, however, perhaps come as a useful card to play in negotiations for more or stronger US military and security commitments to them. So, I think that is also a factor for why the sort of pan-European nuclear market won't happen. The challenges faced then are, even by, let's say, the approach to developing an independent digital economy in the EU, this idea that you just regulate things enough and eventually the only companies that can compete in the software sector will be European companies and the American companies will go away. I think that there's this is the quiet part they don't say out loud. I think they think that if they put the regulatory burden high enough, basically the ad money and these extremely high valuation companies that you see in the US, that there'll be European copycats of them. The problem is that the infrastructure is just so bad for creating a European startup. There's so little money. It's hard to scale. Merely annoying US companies and fining them or making their life difficult, or worse, making the sort of joint internet work worse, honestly, that will not in itself produce these companies. So the sort of digitalization strategy they've been pursuing won't work either. Another strategy that's being pursued is, the US has a bigger economy, China has a bigger economy, we have a small population, but we have the best educated population in the world. To some extent, this works. The well-funded universities produce a lot of science and retain a surprising amount of talent. Brain drain is a problem, but people are economically irrational or, socially attached enough that if you give them reasonable work at a university, they won't even think twice that they could make 7 times what they're making if they go and work for a big tech company in California. People just don't tend to think that way. They're not economically rational enough for that. So because of that, the education strategy works as a talent retention strategy, and it prevents the destruction of certain kinds of knowledge. But I think because the overall hypothesis of higher education has been refuted, So this is true in the United States as well. The idea that we can just double down into investing in, let's say, high school and university and post-university and just keep improving their quality. And then as a result, we will have a higher quality population that is more valuable economically. I think that's not quite true. I think what it does do is it makes the sorting of talent within a country much more efficient. So Harvard and Yale and all of these schools in the US are efficient at sorting talent and enculturating talent within the United States to some degree. And the more kids you convince that they should apply to college, well, the more applicants the elite universities have. And as long as the elite universities select reasonably well, I think that's at least still the case with MIT, even if it's no longer the case with Harvard, the better talent allocation is. But I think the returns are diminishing. Just recently, there was a study published showing that on average, people don't retain any more math after they're 15 or so. It's like if we stop math education at 15, for the average math student, it would make no difference in their adult life, right? So hypothetically, imagine at 60, your last math exam is at 15. And if you do well, you're sorted into continued mathematics education. And if not, well, you're just done with math. It seems to be the result is that average math knowledge wouldn't decrease at all. It seems it's very hard to teach people calculus unless there seems to just be a percentage of the population that gets calculus and a percentage that won't, no matter how long you make them sit in the classroom. So that's what I mean by the refutation of the education hypothesis. The refutation of higher education makes your population smarter. No, higher population tells you who is smart and gives them a job. That's like the best it can do. And the second best is it's maybe a form of UBI where you give basically fake academic jobs because the private sector doesn't demand enough jobs. So I've phrased sort of the problems the EU faces through the problems of the strategies it pursues. And part of the reason is I think the situation of the EU is not promising, but it's not catastrophic. There's no actual one disaster that the EU faces or that the European countries face that will be existential. Not even Russia. Let's be real. Russia could conquer all of Ukraine. It would take decades to reach the point where it would be at all ready to invade the Baltic states or invade Poland and force the annexation of those territories. It just wouldn't be a winnable war. It's not going to pursue that war. And Russia has such deep problems that I think that it's unlikely to be interested in conquering Europe. You know, Russia couldn't conquer Europe under Tsar Alexander. It couldn't conquer Europe under Joseph Stalin. It's certainly not going to conquer Europe under a very old Vladimir Putin. And they know that. Even Putin knows that. So Russia is not existential for Europe. I also think that the multicultural hypothesis of Europe, to actually finish my thought here, Europe faces long-term existential concerns, but they're all of the form of everything gets a little worse every year. None of them are the form of there's a big shock to the system and there's a do or die moment. Because of that, the challenges that are faced are in a way self-imposed. Anyone that is pursuing various plans or goals or ideological agendas like the Greens, the digital strategy, the geopolitical autonomy strategy, the science spending strategy, the education strategy. These, by the way, are things that if you can stomach reading extremely boring EU documents, are discussed and planned explicitly. So this is not a made up strategy. These are just, many 100-page plans that are diligently put into actuality by thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of bureaucrats, mostly based in Brussels, mostly speaking French. So diligent French bureaucrats are carrying out these strategies in dozens of ways. If these self-imposed goals are constant attempts to be agentic and to shape the future, rather than be shaped by it, but they all carry in them these deep fundamental flaws, partially because they all have to be consensus-based and they all have to be group-based. So even if it's not consent of the population of the EU, as we know, when the EU encounters a democratic problem, there's always an oligarchic bypass. The European Constitution was roundly rejected. So you repackage the Constitution as the Treaty of Lisbon, and then you just, you sign a treaty or you repeat a referendum over and over again until the population gives the right answer. That's generally the strategy. So the problem is the consensus of the oligarchs themselves. It selects inherently for bad policy. So oligarchic consensus tends to be not flexible enough and tends to be extractive. And if the oligarchs themselves are very dynamic and producing wealth, this can sort of work. The oligarchic consensus of the Roman Republic works out for the Roman Republic because each of the individual senators is so ambitious and so greedy that they just go out on their own and conquer massive provinces and so on. And then the Senate meets up together and extracts what it can from the Republic, and the Republic doesn't fail. But when you have oligarchic consensus in a relatively stagnant economy or in a society where, there are few live players left, then this kind of system just doesn't work at all. It becomes a centralized, declining empire rather than, a decentralized, expanding empire in a way. There's another plan that I was going to raise, which is sort of the multicultural plan. This one is like, holy shit, no matter what we do, no matter how generous we are, we actually can't raise TFR, total fertility rate, beyond 2.1. So instead, we're going to open ourselves up to immigration. And we will find ways to politically make multicultural society work. That's not worked in any European country, like none of them. And if you go the other route, where you go more the American, the old, not the current American, assimilationist model, well, then you have to up national pride. How can you have an EU-wide policy of upping ideologically national pride and civic ideology in over 20 states? You're basically funding your own dissolution if you do that, right? So the EU can't support nationalist ideologies because it's self-undermining. If the nationalist ideology, such as what the United States has, we could call it patriotic if the word nationalist is offensive. That's precisely what allows you to assimilate large numbers of immigrants and get the economic benefits of that. Also, the economic benefits of immigration aren't really compatible with the welfare state. There have been dozens of studies that have clearly demonstrated that in every single European country, the social service cost of an additional worker coming in from, less privileged background outweigh the economic benefits. So you're actually increasing the tax burden, not decreasing it. The only countries where maybe this isn't the case are sort of like pseudo low taxation, low benefit countries of Eastern Europe, places like Poland and so on. But even in those countries, they will face the problem that, as the 21st century becomes a century where global population is scarce, eventually they'll be competing for immigrants, not with like France or whatever. They'll be competing for immigrants with the city of London or Australia or Canada or the United States. There will just be better places to migrate. So if one is moving from the Philippines, wouldn't one prefer to move to the United States rather than Poland? If one's moving from Vietnam, or if one is moving from Pakistan, obviously, like the US was just better. Even Canada is just better than Poland. So even those countries, if they have their lower taxes and they have less generous welfare systems, they will not be able to get much economic benefit from it. So really the problems are hard to overcome. In theory, you could create a synthetic sort of like European superstate nationalism. Like at the end of the day, that's what America did in the 19th century. People stopped being proud of being, from New England or being from Georgia or from being from Mississippi or New Orleans, and they started becoming proud of being American. these United States became the United States, but that required a civil war. And I don't see a mechanism through which there would be a civil war in Europe. And more importantly, unlike in the American case, I can't see foreign powers allowing one side to win the Civil War. In the US Civil War in the 19th century, the great hope of the South was that Britain and France would side with them. But Britain and France had as much interest in the North as they had in the South, right? There were already various economic and other interests there. For Europe, I don't think there's any major power. If there was, say, a coalition war between, let's say the parts of Europe that didn't want to be in a superstate and the part that really insisted on the superstate, or there was some ideological fight, maybe half of Europe, becomes super nationalist, anti-Islam, and the other half is like very liberal. One jokes, but one could easily imagine like a culture war, like what you see in the US between blue states and red states, boiling over between, say, I don't know, a conservative Poland and a very liberal Germany, where Germany is like, this is literally another Holocaust. You're banging headscarves and you're like deporting Muslims. This is unacceptable. And the Polish are like, you are literally Nazis. You're invading, you're trying to dominate Poland. Are you going to invade us? And then they actually fight. It's not ridiculous at all. This is how unions collapse. That's how Yugoslavia collapsed and so on. And Germans do have like a kind of liberal imperialism that they're in total denial of themselves. Every time there's a regulatory issue, there's a desire to have the most moral policy and then impose it on Eastern Europe. They do this on energy. They do this on other topics. And in Eastern Europe, the goal is still to become as rich as Western Europe. So I think that even in that case, the Russians would support one side of that civil war. The Americans would support the other. The Chinese would probably support the Russian side or maybe not. And all of these countries would just keep on fighting and there would be no resolution. There wouldn't be a victor of another European civil war, right? If we poetically call World War I the first European civil war because it smashes the concert of Europe, smashes that old international aristocratic elite that used to exist in Europe that, you could say was piloting European Western civilization. If you had a second European civil war of that type fighting between these countries, I don't think there would be a winner. And because of that, I don't think there would be significant integration. And I think that therefore the mechanism through which superstates came to be historically, which was war, it's not going to result in a European superstate. I think a sufficiently great live player or coalitions of live players could find a way to peacefully integrate Europe, or to integrate Europe if Europe happened to enter a war on the same side as the United States. Live players could probably unify Europe during the course of fighting with the United States against an enemy, and the US would allow it since this enemy, be it Russia or China or India or whatever, would be so dangerous that they would have to allow their allies to merge, to be functional. But, I don't think Europe has such great founders in store unless ambition becomes much more accepted on the continent.
I want to be mindful of time. Should we wrap on that point, or is there any other sort of last points we want to wrap this excellent conversation in?
I think that Europe needs to face that it does not have any easy answers. And it needs to face that the multicultural program that it embarked upon is a failure. Yet at the same time, the world has moved on and the small countries cannot remain fragmented. So a political compromise must be struck that results in European integration. A few of the medium-sized countries can perhaps pursue their own future. But for the rest of the continent, if they have live players, but for the rest of the continent, completing the integration on favorable terms should be the goal. And changing the ideology of the union, fighting over what the ideology of the union should be the key political question. It's no longer a question of if, it's just a question of when and how.
I think that's a good place to wrap. Samo, thank you for the excellent conversation, and until next time, we'll get into Eastern Europe perhaps on a deeper level next time.
Thank you, Erik.
Thanks for listening to Live Players. Please subscribe, leave a review, and check out Samo's excellent newsletter, The Bismarck Brief, for more rigorous analysis of key individuals, institutions, or industries. Live Players is a production of Turpentine, the podcast network behind Econ 102 with Noah Smith and Moment of Zen.